Yep, let me just hit the button.
Okay, why don't you just why don't I tell you? You can do a 5 seconds or something. Yep, there it goes.
Hit it. Yeah.
All right, well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the National History Academy Speaker Series. We're incredibly excited to have Ed O'Keefe here tonight to talk about Teddy Roosevelt and the Theodore Roosevelt Library and Museum in North Dakota. Again, my name is Bill Sellers. I'm the president of National History Academy, and I know we've got some guests and some observers on Facebook tonight. But National History Academy was started 2 years ago as a residential program, bringing students in from all around the country to learn about the foundations of democracy and responsibilities of citizenship through place-based learning, Harvard Business School cases through the Case Method Institute, and parliamentary debate. With the coronavirus, we've shifted to an online program, so we're incredibly excited to have we're now 4 days into our online program with we have 226 students this week from all around the country, and I think over the summer we have 18 different foreign countries represented as well. We'll have 4 one-week sessions, each built around one of the Case Method Institute's cases, and virtual site visits to different major historic sites around the country. So we're incredibly enthusiastic and excited about everything that we're doing this summer to help address this crisis in historical and civic literacy in the country. And to start off, we have another special guest tonight, Dr. Brent Glass. Dr. Glass is really a co-founder of National History Academy. He's been working with us since 2017 on the project. Dr. Glass is the Executive Director Emeritus of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where he served from 2002 to 2011. Before that, he was the Director of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, where he served from 1987 to 2002. Dr. Glass is one of the top public historians of the country. He recently published 50 Great American Places, Essential Historic Sites across the United States. And we're incredibly lucky to have him here tonight to introduce our distinguished speaker. So, Dr. Glass.
Thank you, Bill, and welcome everyone. It's great to be participating in the National History Academy again this year online, but I see a number of familiar faces on my Zoom screen, and wish we were all together in person, but I think this is just a terrific response to the challenges we have in presenting history to students around the country and around the world. I learned today from Bill that there are students from several different countries, Bill, who are participating in the Academy this year.
18 different countries represented. That's
great. That's great. And I'm very delighted to introduce Ed O'Keefe, who is the first guest speaker in a number of speakers that we'll have during the month of July. Ed is a native of North Dakota, and he will talk more about his North Dakota connections in his remarks later this evening. He now lives in New York City with his family. He is the chief executive officer of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation, and began that position a year ago. And he will also talk more about the plans for the Presidential Library, which will be in North Dakota. He comes to the foundation, the Library Foundation, after a distinguished 20-year career in media and journalism. And I think a whole different program could be organized around his first day on the job at ABC News, which was September 11th, 2001, when he, was a correspondent on Capitol Hill when the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon and the crash of Flight 93 in Pennsylvania occurred. And he was part of a team of reporters who covered that event and won a prestigious Peabody Award for their efforts in covering the events of 9/11. He then went on later on in his career to work at CNN and at CBS News. And at each one of these stops along the way in his career, he and the teams that he worked with received a number of prestigious and important awards for their coverage and for their work in the field. Along the way, he also became a scholar of particularly about Theodore Roosevelt. And he's now working on a book called The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, which will explore the relationship that Roosevelt had with his mother and with his first and second wives and with his sisters. So while he's working as the CEO of the Presidential Library Foundation, he's also writing a book. And I've had that experience of trying to have a day job and also writing a book at the same time. So I don't envy you, Ed, but he's passionate about Theodore Roosevelt and the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt. And I know that one of the major themes in the National History Academy this year is presidential leadership. And so I'm delighted that Ed was able to spend some time with us this week, in our first week, in which we're exploring that theme in various ways, both the high school students and middle school students. So I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce Ed O'Keefe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. I greatly appreciate that very kind introduction. I want to also thank Bill and thank you to Michelle for setting up everything on this Zoom session tonight. I very much wish we could all be together live and in person, but it is sort of miraculous that we're able to do this with such great fluidity. So I will try to make this as lively and engaging a dialogue as possible. We have the chat set up, but I invite questions as we go. I'm going to bring up a presentation just so we have something we can all look at besides myself during the presentation. But again, I'll try not to drone on too long so we have some time for questions. And thank you also to the National History Academy. I think 226 students in 18 countries and being able to forge on in these very unusual circumstances is quite admirable. So I hope you, and I applaud all of you for being here tonight, caring about our country, our values, our world, realizing that we're all global citizens and interconnected in such a strong way has never felt more, more true than in the last few months. So thank you all for being with me. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now and we'll get started. You already know who I am, so I won't take any longer on that. I will just jump to the pillar principles of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. They are leadership, citizenship, and conservation. And again, as I just referenced, what's been so interesting about this global pandemic is that prior to the recent events, these were our pillar principles, and somehow, some way, they've never felt more relevant. Leadership, of course, you know, a pandemic knows no political party. It knows no geographic region. It knows no country of origin or state border. It takes leadership, and I'm so happy to be talking with all of you today because the National History Academy, in my mind, is really imbuing the minds of future leaders, the people of tomorrow that will lead our countries and lead our world to a better place. And that's very much what we hope to accomplish with the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. Citizenship, again, I mentioned at the outset, we're all global citizens, right? Whether we're Americans or from another country, we are all interconnected in a way that is more profoundly true today than it has ever been in the past. And conservation, you know, what have we all wanted to do over the past few months of isolation and quarantine is to get out into the outdoors, to breathe the fresh air, to be back in social circumstances with our friends and our family. We're very happy, of course, to have our lives and our health, and we mourn for those that we've lost. But conservation is about that idea of setting up something for future generations to enjoy. And that was certainly one of the things that Theodore Roosevelt did. So our mission is to explore Theodore Roosevelt's life, legacy, and enduring relevance. Our vision is to inspire action and fearless participation in the arena. And we value daring greatly, thinking boldly, caring deeply, and living passionately. I'm going to start with 3 stories about Theodore Roosevelt that epitomize those values of leadership, citizenship, and conservation. I'm going to start with Booker T. Washington. This is Booker T. Washington. And, you know, Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican who ran as an independent, and today is claimed by all parties. You know, this is the person, Theodore Roosevelt, who was named by Elizabeth Warren as her ideal vice president, who was claimed by John McCain as his hero, who was claimed by both Barack Obama and Mitt Romney in 2012 as their ideal president. 100 years after the death of Theodore Roosevelt, he really is a quintessentially American president without party. And one of these examples that I'd like to share with you today is of his progressive nature. On October 16th, 1901, he'd only been president for a month. President Theodore Roosevelt invited the influential founder of the Tuskegee Institute, Booker T. Washington, to dinner at the White House. Washington was among the last generation of Black American leaders who was born into slavery. He was a proponent of racial uplift via education and entrepreneurship, and he grew to be a multi-millionaire on that education empire. He controlled most of the national Black newspapers at the time and was a highly influential ally to Roosevelt, who often sought his advice and support. They corresponded for the rest of their lives. Now, it might not seem like a courageous act today to have an African American to the White House, but it had never been done. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to have a Black man to the White House for dinner. They were served by a Black butler. Washington, Roosevelt, and First Lady Edith and a family friend discussed Southern politics, continuing their conversation about appointing African Americans to government posts on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. Roosevelt did put many different African Americans in federal positions for the first time. The Associated Press broke the story the following morning, and Roosevelt, who was the first president of both a Northern father and a Southern mother, he literally had grown up in a house divided, in a country divided. The nation was shocked, and there was an outpouring of venom from newspapers, piles of hate mail from constituents. Roosevelt had underestimated his own public stature as well as the state of affairs with the South, where Black disenfranchisement was on the rise and lynchings were still at 100 per year. You can see here, Roosevelt denounced by the Southerners. In the North, the president commended, nothing to say to the critics from Booker T. Washington. So this is the man who charged up San Juan and Kettle Hill in the Spanish-American War was cowed by the racist rage of his fellow Americans. He had risked pushing the White House into a new era, but the risk of losing Southern votes kept him from pushing further. Roosevelt did not apologize for the incident, but he never again had Washington to the White House for dinner. Through this story, it's sort of a duality, especially considering in light of recent events, that we understand Roosevelt both as a man limited by the political constraints of the time, yet one who still lived out his principles and stood his ground for something he saw as right. He did not apologize for what he viewed was just, but he also didn't push progress beyond the social conventions of the time. The next story I want to share with you just quickly is a very good example, I think, of leadership. This is John Mitchell. And during Roosevelt's time, he was a man of firsts. He was the first president to fly an airplane. He was the first to own an automobile. He was the first to dive in a submarine or visit a foreign country while in office. And in October of 1902, just a year after having Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner, he embarked on another pioneering moment as the first president to mediate one of the 20th century's most pressing issues, a labor dispute. In 1901, the coal fields of eastern Pennsylvania had been smoldering with unrest. Miners working under brutal conditions for low wages embarked on months-long strike under the leadership of this man, 32-year-old United Mine Workers President John Mitchell. The pits that powered the industrial age, steamships, railroads, 10 million tons of coal came to a complete and total halt. Coal was in such short supply that schools and factories were closed. Families sheltered in place due to a lack of heat in the frigid winter. There was social unrest. 1,000 bullets were exchanged between a mob and the police in Pennsylvania. There were dozens and dozens of injuries. Does any of this sound a little familiar? Right? Sheltering in place, social unrest. All of this is amazingly cognizant and resonant today with rumors of further violence, Roosevelt decided he would step in. He had been wheelchair bound due to a recent operation. He summoned the railroad executives and the mine owners and John Mitchell to Washington and basically made them talk through their differences. The negotiations went on for days without a settlement when the violence continued in the valleys. Finally, one night, J.P. Morgan, whose steamship conglomerates and 21 railroads were dependent on coal, came to Roosevelt and demanded they hammer out an agreement. The resulting agreement effectively ended the strike and the country's power supply hummed back to life. But what was interesting about this moment is Roosevelt had stepped directly into the fray of free market capitalism, technically as a third party, but ultimately in support of a square deal for the working man. He had sided with labor. That had never been done in the history of the country. The president intervening in a free market moment and siding on behalf of labor. He successfully fought for the worker, articulating a particular vision of relationships between America and business, much of which is the continuing subject of debate today. I think this, of course, is an example of leadership and citizenship. But to look at conservation, probably Roosevelt's greatest legacy is conservation. As many of you know, Roosevelt is embedded within the deep cultural appreciation for the outdoors. When he was girding himself for re-election in 1903, now just a year after the coal strike and 2 years after having Booker T. Washington to the White House, he set aside 2 months for a whistle-stop tour through 25 states. He gave 262 speeches, but for 2 weeks in the spring, Roosevelt went silent. On the morning of April 8th, 1903, Roosevelt disembarked from his personal car on his private train, left the press behind, and joined up with conservationist John Burroughs. The friendship of this bearded sage, revered by Americans for his environmental writing, must have reminded Roosevelt of his early desire to make natural science into his chosen profession. Roosevelt had arrived in this region as a hunter, but even on this trip, he called ahead to reserve hounds before it would determine that hunting would probably be bad press. He wanted to put his identity as a conservationist on full display. Burroughs' presence was an assurance to the reporters watching that the two men here riding into Yellowstone National Park with an escort of cavalrymen, that Roosevelt planned to kill no animals on this excursion. Roosevelt's bloodlust died a bit hard. During one suspicious disappearance from camp, the party heard the distinctive sound of rifle bullets, but for the most part, Roosevelt spent his time in the park observing and counting elk, enlivened by the philosophical knowledge of the flora and fauna and his belief in the power of nature to heal the human spirit. This is another duality of Roosevelt. The great conservationist is actually a hunter. It's one of those things that we are thinking about and struggling with as we talk about the TR Presidential Library. This is Roosevelt at Yellowstone National Park. His energy would manifest as an outpouring of protective legislation. Ultimately, Theodore Roosevelt, in his 7 years as president, would set aside 230 million acres of public land, 150 national forests, 51 federal bird reserves, 18 national monuments, and 4 national game preserves. It is an incredible legacy that really was the first to think about the national parks and enormous tracts of western forest, bird refuges, game preserves, cliff dwellings, glaciers, and canyons in a tradition of American conservation that, again, continues to this day. So I've just shared with you 3 very, very brief examples of leadership, conservation, and citizenship. So how is this factoring into our thinking about the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library? We want to have a legacy for today to create a new tomorrow. Again, I mentioned the duality of Roosevelt. What's so interesting about this American president is, again, both a Republican who, when he felt his party was not doing right, abandoned his party and ran as a progressive, somebody who was born in the East, but identified very closely with the West. He had a Northern mother and a Southern father, a Northern father and a Southern mother. Very interesting identity for someone who would bring forth Booker T. Washington for dinner at the White House. And his enduring legacy is in what he set aside, what he used his power to actually set aside without development in the national parks. And beyond any statue or any memorial, this is probably the greatest living legacy of Theodore Roosevelt. We want to create a center to empower courage in the civic arena. Again, I think you probably are all familiar with the in the arena speech. And that is, of course, encouraging you not to be on the sidelines, to do as you're doing tonight, to be a part of the National History Academy, to be appreciative of civics and American history, to understand your relationship as global citizens to the world, and to be in the arena agitating for action, to be the change that you want to see in the world. So I get asked a lot, why North Dakota? You said he's from New York and he was the governor of New York. So why are we building this in North Dakota? So as some of you may know, Roosevelt very famously said that it was in North Dakota that the romance of his life began. He later said, I would never have been president if it not had been for my experiences here in North Dakota. He came to North Dakota in the small town you see on the left, Medora, North Dakota specifically, after the death of his wife and mother on the same day in the same house, February 14th, 1884. That's the subject that I'll be delving into in the loves of Theodore Roosevelt that Dr. Glass referenced at the beginning. But we really see this as sort of a crucible experience. This is the fulcrum of the hero's journey in an incredible life story. This is the place where he came for quiet and solitude to mourn and recover, where he was abjectly depressed, no question, but he found the resilience to go on, and in some ways became the hero of his own story. So we're looking to inspire people to understand the relationship with nature and the importance of conservation, but also that critical component of getting in the arena and seeking action. This is a place to restore and savor the splendor of the Badlands. This is the landscape that Theodore Roosevelt woke up to every morning and went to sleep to every night for the larger part of 2.5 years. And he would return 20 times to this place, oftentimes making some of his most important political speeches either before or after having visited the splendor of nature. And we want to really think about, whereas other presidential libraries have guests, we have participants. Where other libraries may have exhibits, we want to offer experiences. If a presidential library is really primarily to tell the president's story, oftentimes to write that first draft of history, we want to tell the people's story. We want to tell your story. We want to leave a legacy for tomorrow. Instead of having archives of an analog figure, we want to be the first to digitize those analog archives and make them as available to a third grader doing their first book report to any of you who may be the next Edmund Morris to discover some connection in all of these different papers and archives. And again, instead of being a static museum, we want to be a living library. I think we've all proven in what we're doing tonight that digital native is just the way of the world. We're going to have to be able to communicate on platforms such as this, rather than always relying on the physical visitation to an actual spot. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I said I would be brief, and I wanted to intentionally, try to talk about some specific examples, but to leave plenty of time to have a dialogue with all of you. I see that there's a couple of questions, so I'll start there, and then if anybody wants to chime in with a verbal question or continue through the chat. Dr. Glass has asked, can you talk about the legislation to protect and expand public lands? Yes. So as I mentioned in conservation, the 1906 Antiquities Act essentially gave the executive, the president, the power to set aside national monuments and land that were deemed of great value to the country and its future. I'm going to go ahead and my video's off. Apologies. Thank you, Bill. There, now you can see me. So the 1906 Antiquities Act gave President Roosevelt the power to act unilaterally, and he sure took advantage of that unilateral ability. As I mentioned, for the first time, being able to set aside 230 million acres of public lands, either as national parks or as monuments or as forest. He was the creator of the U.S. Forest Service, which continues to this day. And the Antiquities Act, interestingly enough, becomes a point of controversy in many different administrations because it is a pure executive power that can be levered without congressional involvement. So at the end of the Obama administration, for instance, there were vast tracts of land in Utah and elsewhere. Bears Ear was a particularly controversial one that was set aside through the 1906 Antiquities Act. So this legacy that is over 100 years old is still used today, sometimes very controversially. Another question from Sebastian Winter is, are you in collaboration with Sagamore Hill and the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace? Yes. Yes, we most definitely are. Sue Sarna, the curator at Sagamore Hill, who's been there for 30 years, is an amazing friend and ally. She is someone who, interestingly enough, was not an early supporter of the TR Presidential Library. She said sort of, well, you know, we have Sagamore Hill. But as we talked more about that last slide that I walked through, how at other presidential libraries, we like to say, you know, this might be where dad drags his kids. We want this to be where kids drag dad, right? We want this to be an experience. We want it to be a place where you can physically feel what it must have been like to travel and navigate the river of doubt. We want you to dare greatly in the experience of the museum so you can learn from, not just about Theodore Roosevelt. And that's really what's helped in that relationship with the birthplace and Sagamore Hill, because they have to preserve things as they were. People come to that and they want to see Theodore Roosevelt's desk. They want to see his bedroom. They want to see his dressing quarters. They don't want an interpretation of an experience. So that gives us an opening to do something completely different. Benjamin has asked, does inviting Booker T. Washington instead of, say, W.E.B. Du Bois reflect TR's politics around race? Was he less for progressive civil rights legislation? That's a great question, Benjamin. I would think that this is where, you know, the word progressive has certainly evolved over 100 years. And contextually, Theodore Roosevelt is someone who endorses suffrage in 1880, 40 years before women will get the right to vote. He is someone who has Booker T. Washington to dinner, but he doesn't use his power to act in overtly progressive ways to equal racial inequity, right? He does appoint many Black Americans to federal positions, something that Woodrow Wilson in a decade or so later will largely undo. So he did certain things, but he was not what I would consider as progressive as what would be modernly interpreted as progressive. So that's a very, very good question. So I've got a question here from Robert about the TR, address TR and his use of executive orders, which are now becoming increasingly controversial as they are used for more and more in the face of congressional dysfunction. Well, I think, as John said, he was more of a lead by example president, right? I mean, this is a president who probably would have really enjoyed Twitter. He probably would have had absolutely no fear of new media, of getting engaged in conflict, of being an abrasive personality at times. And he had no fear at all of using the powers he was given, whether they were congressionally, I shouldn't say sanctioned. I mean, the 1906 Antiquities Act did pass Congress, but you know, he was one of the first to really take that executive power into the 20th century conception of the executive. I mean, his line is interrupted by people who were not as overtly in favor of using that executive power. You know, it's interesting that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, obviously a Democrat, not a Republican, who was married to his niece, Eleanor Roosevelt, will come to power and almost exactly models his career on TR. I mean, he's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He's governor of New York. He has a fair deal instead of a square deal. I mean, you know, there's a rift in the TR-FDR line, the Oyster Bay Roosevelts and the Hyde Park Roosevelts, but you have to wonder what might have happened had TR lived in a different time. Would he have been closer to the progressive values of FDR and further from the values of the Republican Party of his age, which did cause him to leave the party and run as a third-party independent, and have still today the most successful third-party run in US history. So Avery asks, what were TR's thoughts on women's rights, gender roles, feminism? Great question. So you've asked the right person, since I am writing the loves of Theodore Roosevelt. I contend that Theodore Roosevelt is the most masculine president in American history who is actually the product of incredibly strong women. There were just phenomenal women in his life that in another age, at another time, would have far exceeded TR. He was encouraged by and counseled by his elder sister, Bammy, who 60 years later, I would equate her to Robert F. Kennedy, to John F. Kennedy. You know, he appointed his brother Attorney General and was in the cabinet. I think Bammy could have been in another time easily in Roosevelt's cabinet. 100 years later, most likely Bammy is the one running for public office, maybe not TR. You know, it was unusual for that time for someone of his social stature to run for public office. Politics was considered sort of a dirty sport, and not many came down from his echelon to participate in it. Bammy was an incredible counselor, someone who really helped him understand the political dynamics of the situation. His younger sister, Connie, was an emotional support system. He corresponded with Edith Wharton throughout his entire life. As I mentioned before, he endorsed suffrage in 1880, but he had also this kind of uncomfortable view on women's rights and gender roles. He sort of said, hey, if you're a woman and you're going to work, if you're going to be in society, you're going to be a judge or a lawyer, or you're going to be in active political life, you should have every right as a man. But if you're not, then because you're a woman and you're the only one capable of child rearing, then your primary obligation is to the children. And so there's this incredibly frustrating duality within Theodore Roosevelt that you know, again, he's sort of like a Rorschach test. Whatever you see in him says more about you than it says about him. Because everything he ever thought, everything he ever believed, he put down on paper. And he had the luxury then of not tweeting it, you know, of not having everything that he ever said come back to haunt him. He could change his mind. He could evolve his position. He could think abstractly on a challenge. So, you know, I wouldn't put him in the league of Eleanor Roosevelt, his niece, 60 years later, but someone who deeply cared about women's rights and equality. But there's going to be some really frustrating things in his writings and sayings and speeches where you look back 100 years later and think, is this the same guy? So let's see, we've got a lot coming in now. So this is good from Joshua. If Roosevelt became president in 1912, how much do you think history would have changed, seeing as World War I loomed ahead? What a great, I love counterfactuals. I love thinking about the what if sliding doors of history. And, you know, I think Roosevelt was obviously, again, in that duality, both what you might consider a warmonger, but he also won the Nobel Peace Prize. In his 7.5 years as president, there was no war. I mean, there was no conflict. He resolved a conflict and won the Nobel Peace Prize. So what an incredible duality. Again, he was a big supporter of America going into World War I. He encouraged his son, Quentin, to join the war effort, and his son, Quentin, died as a pilot in World War I. And very famously or infamously, the Germans posed with a picture of Quentin's deceased body in France, and it devastated Roosevelt. It absolutely crushed him. The Roosevelt descendants that we're working with now really believe that that was the spiritual end of his life. He died at 60 years old, January 6, 1919. Sort of the strenuous life had taken its toll, but the psychological loss of his son in a war that he had agitated. And now think about this. His son dies in World War I, a war he supports. His eldest son, Ted, will die not in D-Day, but just a few days after D-Day in World War II, again, trying to live up to the heroics of his father. His other son, Kermit, who was with him on the River of Doubt, who was with him on the African safari, is so close to his father and is so devastated by his death that 20 years later, he will die by suicide. And, you know, so there's a really complicated legacy in history of someone who was so for American expansion, for American intervention, for World War I. You know, I would say that he probably would have gotten into World War I sooner And who knows what that might have done to the country and the world. And but he also ran on a progressive ticket, which endorsed suffrage. The 1912 progressive ticket endorsed suffrage. So here, almost a decade before the women are given right to vote, who knows? I mean, so there's so many different ways that could go. So Matthew asked, what was TR's most controversial act as president, and what were his reasons to commit that action? Ooh, Dr. Glass may have to help me here. I mean, his probably Brownsville. Brownsville would be his most controversial act, not forgiving, not pardoning the African-American brigade, the infantry that was a part of his Rough Rider troop. Again, this is where race becomes a very complicated issue for TR, because he has Booker T. Washington to the White House. He appoints Black Americans to the federal appointments, but he doesn't use his power overtly to create or to reduce inequality. And Brownsville, if you dive a little deeper, I'm not an expert in that particular incident, but that is undoubtedly, if you do some investigation, something you'd have to look to as his, and he did it, I think, because he had this law and order approach to everything in his life. There was right and there was wrong and there was the law. You think about when he was NYPD commissioner and he enforced the Sunday liquor laws, which were to close all bars in New York. Incredibly unpopular when he did it, but he essentially said, that's the law. If you want to change the law, then change the law, but I will enforce what is meant to be enforced. So sometimes his deep, deep, deep philosophy, sort of similar to what would have happened if he'd been elected in 1912, well, his deep commitment to American intervention and America's power in the world cost him his son, cost him his eldest son eventually, and cost him his youngest son to suicide. So these decisions cut both ways. So let's see. John says, I'm working on my Eagle Scout rank. Congratulations, John. That's amazing. And in our youth program, we learn a lot about outdoor ethics. We study TR extensively to understand the balance that he set between conservationism and hunting. Every scout comes to an interesting conclusion. TR conserved nature through national parks and encouraging hunting regulations so that the future generations of America also have the same experiences in nature. Being a conservationist is a part of being a hunter, because if you don't conserve, there's nothing left to hunt. It actually made a lot of sense for him to be a conservationist. I think that's an excellent point, John. Amy asks, if TR had to choose between his military life versus his presidential position, which one would you say he valued more throughout his lifetime? Great question, Amy. I think that he valued his military experience more than anything in his life. He evidenced by the fact that he preferred to be called Colonel Roosevelt the rest of his life rather than President Roosevelt. Now that being said, I think he enjoyed his military life because he was able to live out the hero's adventure that he'd read about in his childhood. All right, he grew up reading about cowboys, and he went west at the time when America was expanding and the Golden Spike was being laid, connecting the tracks across the North. And really what San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill in the Spanish-American War provided him was an opportunity to be a hero. And if you ever go to Cuba and you walk that hill, it could have ended his life very, very easily. It was rather foolish charge, and had it gone the other way, probably would have been documented as such. But he didn't die, and they did win, and so history favors the bold. But I think he valued his military experience because he was able to live out a story that he'd otherwise only had in his mind. Nadina asks, how do you think the duality in his ideologies affected his policies and diplomacy? That's a great question, Nadina. So I think, again, here is somebody who is from the highest echelon in society, but runs for political office, which at the time is not necessarily what those in high society do. He is from the East, but he forges his political identity in the West. He is a Republican, but he, when in combat with the Republican leadership, runs as an independent progressive in the Bull Moose Party. He is undoubtedly militaristic and believes in American intervention and expansion, yet he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He is incredibly complicated in his ideology and how that results in his policies and diplomacy. I think he really relished being president of the United States. I think he enjoyed the position of power. I think he really, he really fought deeply about issues. He was a reader. He listened to all viewpoints. And when he saw a controversy, he wasn't afraid to get involved, right? He wasn't afraid to act. The worst sin for him would be to sit on the sidelines and do nothing. It didn't matter what you believed. I mean, he'd say in any moment of decision, the right thing, the best thing to do is the right thing. The next best thing is the wrong thing. And the worst thing is nothing, right? He could turn a phrase. He was very good at that. So he would have been good at Twitter again. But I think that, look at the example we went through at the beginning of the presentation, right? He got involved in a labor strike. That had never been done. Theodore Roosevelt saved American college football because it was so violent that the universities that had football on their college campuses were thinking about shutting it down. And he, loving football, called those presidents to the White House and demanded they come up with a solution. The solution was the NCAA to protect the safety and health of student athletes. So I think that's a great question because his duality sometimes led to incredibly frustrating inconsistency that historians still struggle with today. Because again, you say you endorse suffrage in 1880, and yet you say some things about women that make me really uncomfortable today. But he wasn't afraid of any issue, and that was his guiding philosophy, was action. So let's see, we've got, Audrey asks, considering the current two-part system, what can future third-party political candidates take away from TR's duality? Are there tips from his presidency to promote more bipartisan in the president or future tripartisanship? Well, it's a great question, right? I mean, the fact that in 1912, we had the most successful third-party presidential run ever. Ross Perot came close with 19% of the vote, but with almost 29% of the vote, Theodore Roosevelt did remarkably better, and probably was, he was enormously popular, probably the most famous American in the world at that point. So if he couldn't do it in 1912, it doesn't hold out much hope for a third party to succeed in 2020 and beyond. But like TR, it was certainly worth trying. And I think, what's really interesting about that run is also resulted in the presidential primary system, right? So we owe, for better or worse, Donald Trump to Theodore Roosevelt, because the presidential primary system was created at a time when he really felt that the people should rule. Now, he felt the people should rule because he knew the party bosses wouldn't support him. So this is that frustrating duality at work again, right? Is it a political philosophy or is it a political convenience, right? He probably endorsed women's suffrage on the platform in 1912 because, hey, if women are voting, TR is winning. So there's a political reality to his philosophy as well. But I find that sort of interesting. In 1912, he creates the presidential primary system because the system won't let him in. Even though he desperately wants in. And the legacy of that is that, of course, the Democrats eventually adopt different rules for superdelegates and such. The Republicans have not. And you see the result of that system playing out to this day. It's amazing to think that the origins of those actions in the early 1900s are still having resonance today. So Katie asks the question of the moment, what are your thoughts on the removal of the TR statue from the Museum of Natural History in New York? So that's a great question. Katie, obviously it's been something that we as the TR library did not have a direct role in. It's sort of fascinating to me that the city of New York erected that statue in 1940 after the sudden death of TR in 1919. It was meant to be the city of New York's memorial to a great citizen of New York and the governor of New York. I think that it was obviously the right decision because the composition of the statue, whether it was the artistic intent or not in 1940, is horribly incongruent with current reality. And the unfortunate thing is that it is, it is coming at a moment when you wish you could have a more contextualized discussion to separate the composition of a statue with the legacy of an individual, because it's complicated. I mean, his relationship with Native Americans is very complicated. His relationship with African Americans is less complicated, but still complicated. His relationship and viewpoints on women and equality, complicated. But contextualizing it in the moment of the time, not excusing it, is a way that you learn and move forward. So I would say that now we feel greatly privileged because as the TR library, we get to create a library in the 2020s, not the 1920s, right? We get to think about how to tackle these issues head on. We are not going to shy away from the controversies with Native Americans or the controversies with African Americans or the beliefs and thoughts and dualities on women's rights and suffrage. There's a lot to love about Theodore Roosevelt, but there is, as any scholar or historian will say, if you spend a day with his archive, you come out as frustrated as you come out inspired. And that's where the tension of history allows you to learn. And I think I'm very glad for that question because I think, it's interesting. Theodore Roosevelt didn't even want a statue, a memorial. His statue, his memorial is the national parks. I mean, if you could take away, he said it in his lifetime, take away every memorial that's ever been given, and I would trade it gladly for the legacy of the national parks. So sometimes in intending to honor people, we end up doing it in a way that they wouldn't have even wanted, and unfortunately conflate the artistic interpretation with the legacy of the person, which deserves a fuller examination. Carter asks, what in your opinion is the best biography of TR? Well, I think this is a great question, Carter, because until you can buy The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, you're gonna have to go with, well, there's two recommendations. Kathy Dalton's A Strenuous Life is the best single volume biography of TR. If you really want to go the distance and run the marathon, Edmund Morris's trilogy, which begins with the rise of Theodore Roosevelt, is, despite now being 40 years old, a classic of the canon. Beautiful writing, very lyrical, and totally inspiring. I think what's interesting about Kathy Dalton, to some of the questions that we've gotten earlier, is that she published her book, and Kathy is a Story Council advisor to the Presidential Library. She published her book in 2002, right after 9/11. And she had researched Theodore Roosevelt for 40 years. She did her PhD on TR. And she waited that long to publish her book because her thoughts on TR are actually very different than a lot of the people that like to hold TR up as a paragon of masculinity, of the macho image of a warmongering American expansionist. Her feeling was actually, there's a sensitive side here. There's a whole other layer of understanding where knowing how he grew up as an asthmatic child, very challenged, was not about making his body as much as it was really proving himself in the world and trying to live up to the image of his father. And she contextualizes it brilliantly in The Age. That, think about this, right? Theodore Roosevelt is born in 1858. There's no electricity. There's no automobiles. There's no telephones. There's certainly no submarines. He will be the president that flies an airplane, that goes in a submarine, that does all of these firsts, right? He's living in a time where the whole society is switching from farm to factory. So life is disrupted. The American economy is disrupted. There is a whole sweeping change in the country. Technology is moving so fast, and the way you earn work and you redeem yourself as a person is changing, right? That's now, right? We have so much to learn from him then and from history, because what are we experiencing now? The internet is displacing physical stores, probably accelerated by the experience we're having now in the pandemic, right? I mean, you're seeing a society shift from office-based work with a very strict hierarchy of achievement to entrepreneurism, right? To Silicon Valley, to Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all of these different technologies and platforms that didn't exist and make no sense to a generation that grew up without them, right? And make no sense in the sense that, well, how do you make any money? I mean, when Facebook was invented in 2004, not that long ago, 16 years, right? And really hit the mainstream in about 2007, it was, the biggest question was, well, how are you gonna make any money on that? It's nice and you can communicate, but how are you gonna make any money? That upended the entire economy and the way that we work and value employees and and that's what Theodore Roosevelt experienced, right? So what I like about Kathy Dalton is she takes you into the time and says, what's fascinating about Roosevelt is not necessarily how he viewed women in 1901, because, hey, if he lived in 2001, presumably he'd be a little more advanced in his thinking. But what's interesting is to understand how he came to that view and what life was like in that moment to help build such a very progressive character for the time, but would obviously leave some frustration in modern era. Okay, so we should take one more question, and we'll have a wrap-up question from Bill. So let's see, Ashley asked me, what has been my favorite part or most interesting part of the TR library? So I think I'll answer quickly because I know we're running out of time and we want to ask one more from Bill. I would say we're building a presidential library 100 years after the president left this earth. And that has been both an incredible liability and an amazing opportunity, because we don't need to burnish TR's legacy. His legacy is set, right? Barack Obama is currently at work in his presidential center. And a big objective of the Obama Presidential Center is, of course, to brandish the Obama legacy, right? And that's okay. That's what presidential libraries are typically for. But if we have this very unique opportunity to go back in time and create something now, how do we make it such that it's scholarly and academically legitimate, but that you all want to go, right? That you literally want to drag your parents there and say, I want to go here and feel it and experience it and run it and taste it and be there. And everything that we're doing is inverting the typical model. We want to bring you into the library to kick you out into the national park. We want you to be able to hike and bike and ride a horse straight up to the library, right? We want you to come in and see that it's not like, it's not digital borrowed. It is infused with a digital life that is really going to define all of your futures. So the most exciting part has been, as most circumstances are, the hardest part, which is, well, TR isn't here to tell us, I wouldn't want that. but that gives us an opportunity too. So Bill, I'll leave it to you for the last question.
All right. Well, that just my question is kind of a follow-up on that. I'm a huge fan of ambitious projects, and to take on something like this, to start a presidential library from scratch, 100 years after TR's death, how do you go about that? How do you create state partnerships and federal partnerships? How do you raise money? All of those things that go into it. I saw a question about, do you have partnerships with the National Archives or with Sagamore Hill? How do you start?
Well, you have great conversations with people like Dr. Glass, who have been there and done it and have designed some of the world's greatest institutions. You listen to the partners that currently exist. Someone mentioned Sagamore Hill and the Boyhood Home. We try to talk with them about what they've created and what their frustrations are. 99.5% of the TR archive and artifacts have never seen the light of day. You've never ever seen them. Right? There is no single place. You can go to Sagamore, you can go to the Boyhood Home, you get a little slice of everything that's out there to be discovered. Partnerships with the National Park Service, partnership with the state of North Dakota. The state of North Dakota passed a $50 million endowment contingent on our ability to raise $100 million in private funds. So a big part of my job has been going out and selling the vision of this library and saying to philanthropists, now in the face of a pandemic and resulting economic recession, that this is a project worth believing in, and that it's important to have a place of leadership, citizenship, and conservation that is not about political party, that it is a place that you can convene and have civic dialogue, that intentionally we do not want to endorse one philosophy over another, because 100 years later, what would be the point of that? The world does not need a deification of TR. The world does not need another think tank. The world does not need some other place that becomes a relic the moment after it's built. We have a very unique opportunity to say this is a place where if you are in the arena, if you care about an issue, you are invited to come and debate it and have your say, but you have to do it respectfully, and you have to do it with civility and citizenship as your objective. And so I have to say, there's been a thirst for that. We have not yet publicly announced where we are in our capital campaign, but I can assure you that this library is going to be built. And it's because I think that there is a passion, and I hope if I can leave one message with all of you, the future generation of leaders who can serve and think about citizenship, it would be that don't get dragged down by the current mode of conversation or the lack of civility in American politics. We have had moments like this in our history. If you look back and learn, you see the examples, and what happens is America wins. America forges through. The democracy survives, and there is a need and a great unquenched desire for citizenship and leadership. And we want to be that institution that encourages civic dialogue. And just so you start with a message, and you start with a mission, and you find people aligned with those values that can help you move forward.
Well, thank you so much. That's tremendous advice, and I'm excited to make my first trip to North Dakota in I guess 3 years. That's outstanding.
No, that's all right.
Yes. Well, one of our speakers next week is David Bella, who's the acting director of National Park Service, and I do think about what advice TR might have 117 years later or 104 years later about the National Park Service.
Yes, and we are partnered with David. I should have mentioned, that's an excellent cue to remind me that we're going to be the only presidential library next to a national park, and the only national park next to a presidential library. So while our facility will be something like 100,000 square feet of experience and action, you'll have 75,000 acres to explore right next to it with an interconnected experience. And that's a big part of what we're trying to achieve here. Your question, Bill, we start with that conversation with the national park. And David Vela has been a tremendous, tremendous partner. His whole career has been in the National Park Service, actually running parks as superintendent and making his way through the Department of Interior. So I strongly encourage you to tune in next week with David. He's a really interesting person who's had a very storied career and really knows something about giving back and working for something bigger for future generations, which is dedicating life to the national parks.
Outstanding. Well, this is a great way to kick off our speaker series. Our high school students have visited Mount Vernon and James Madison's Montpelier this week. Our middle school students have visited FDR's Hyde Park today, Abraham Lincoln's home yesterday, and Monticello the day before. So, you know, I could not imagine a more appropriate speaker to kick off this series. And I thank you so much, Mr. O'Keefe.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone. Godspeed, and I hope you all have a wonderful summer despite these very challenging circumstances, and congratulations for participating in such a wonderful program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one.